Hi everyone. There seems to be some confusion amongst modern third-wave feminists as to the reasons why a lot of women today actually reject the tenets of third-wave feminism. And this is shown publicly sometimes by some of the video campaigns, I don't need feminism because, and they might list the reasons, I'm not a victim, etc., etc. And also the recent hashtag, women against feminism. And there seems to be a little bit of confusion as to how this could possibly be that women would reject feminism. There's a false equivalence being drawn here between women and feminists. And I would say, I think the reason why that is because reasonable people tend to reject ideologies or tenets of ideologies that are radicalized or extremist, these positions that are extremist. And I would say a lot of the platforms and tenets of third-wave feminism are extremist and radicalized positions. Now, when I say reasonable people, I mentioned the public displays of rejection of modern feminism. But of course, I think the majority of women who reject feminism do so quietly. It's, they just go about their daily lives and they see some of the crazy and they decide that that's not something that they would like to self-identify with. And a good number of them have made some very good videos that I've enjoyed recently to intersperse with my study, shall we say, on the current sort of feminist platform. I think one of the ways that you can tell if an ideology is extremist or has become radicalized is if they make their position by stating things that are demonstrably false, that are just divorced from reality, and also if they do so sometimes disingenuously. I think really actually a good example of that for the women who reject the tenets of third-wave feminism is the response from feminists. It's kind of interesting, too, because on the one hand, they'll say it's racist to try to push some of the Western feminist agenda on people in the Middle East, we're sort of saying that these women just don't know any better. They're just so ignorant and dumb as to their own oppression that we shouldn't promote, human rights and that sort of thing there. But then they will turn around to women in the West who reject the tenets of third-wave feminism, and they'll say that they actually will call them idiots. They will call them ignorant, and they will say things like, oh, you should just stop voting then. You should find your place, back in the kitchen, barefoot and pregnant. You should give up all of the rights that were gained for you by the first waves of feminism, the waves of feminism that did productive and constructive work, making again this false equivalence between some of the tenets of third-wave feminism and some of the earlier aspects of the movement. And often we'll see some of these very same feminists demonizing what they might consider to be their opponents in a very disingenuous way, twisting words and thinking that they can sort of assign whatever intent they want to actions or words that may not be representative of the original intent of that person. And it's no mystery to me that reasonable people everywhere would reject an ideology that promotes itself in this fashion. A good example of this disingenuous demonizing of their opponent's position by sort of reframing it to make it seem other than what it was is in some of the criticism or backlash that feminists sometimes get and how they respond to that. So you might have a person who's either anti-feminist or even just someone who would consider themselves to be egalitarian that would say, hey, listen, I'm a free-thinking individual, fair-minded, and I believe in equality. But, we may not have a system of perfect equality in the West. There probably can and never will be perfect equality. But women have protections under the law. Women have equality under the law. And there are problems that both biological genders face. Men have their issues, which some people are working on. A lot of them have to do with reproductive and familial rights. Women have the issues that, of course, we've all heard about as well. And but really, the war has more or less been won, and we've got some finer points to deal with. But when we start to talk about microaggressions and manspreading and things like that, I think we're really getting carried away here. But there are some women in other parts of the world that don't have it so good, that are oppressed in an old world sort of fashion, and they could really use your help and, of course, all of our help. And we don't often hear enough is being done by modern feminists about those conditions. The focus seems to be on the very, very micro elements of what they see as oppression and anti-liberation here in the West. And I think that's a reasonable challenge made by reasonable people. What about the women in Muslim countries? What about the women in other areas of the world where there are bride burnings and all kinds of other horrific things that really are taking place today? Oftentimes, it's not even lip service paid to the plight of women in other countries. I made a video some videos back this spring sort of lashing out against Barack Obama for his speech that he gave when the Saudi king passed away. And they seemed to be heaping all this praise on him, and there wasn't much mention of the plight of women in Saudi Arabia. And Barack Obama had also given a speech about women's issues where he promoted the false statistics that we quite often see, rape statistics and the wage gap issue, but didn't really talk much about the plight of women in places like Saudi Arabia. And I don't often hear many feminists speaking out about Barack Obama's seeming praise of a man who is probably demonstrably a misogynist. And this would include even the plight of the Saudi king's own daughters who were under house arrest. Now, interestingly enough, I've been watching a YouTube video. I'll link it below. It was a conference that was held, I think it was in Australia, like a women in feminism conference. It was in 2015. And Nita Sarkeesian was in attendance there, and they were discussing how to be a feminist. During this conference, they did discuss a little bit about women in third world countries and women in the Middle East and their plight. But it was really mostly as it relates to how women in the West might act and how that might have a trickle-down effect to those women in other countries. That's sort of, how choice feminism may have potentially negative effects on other women, essentially. And they didn't really deal with some of the overt oppression and some of the incredibly barbaric practices that happen in some of those countries. They didn't really discuss any of that until they broached this issue of having that challenge leveled at them. The challenge that they don't address those issues often enough. They spend far too much time tearing down posters about human rights and getting people banned from conferences and talking about manspreading, and not nearly enough times spent on those issues. And the response to this challenge was to say it's a threat. That when people, men, say you should pay attention to what's happening in these countries in the Middle East, etc., what they're really saying is, listen, sweetheart, you should have a look at how those women over there are being treated. That could easily be you. But for our good graces, that could be you. And just remember that. We could turn back to that at any time. They claim it's a threat. In fact, they even go a step further and say that it's a constant threat, that it underpins. It's sort of below the surface at all times. That some men may say, hey, listen, most of us aren't like that. Most of us are not. We don't have actual misogyny. We're not actual misogynists. We love women. We want to promote women. And she would say, well, you're not, carrying an axe around behind them, but this threat is under the surface all the time. That yes, all women feel this threat from all men sort of all the time, and even that it's a constant MRA threat, which is strange to me. Regardless of how you feel about men's rights activists, I don't think it's part of their platform, and I doubt you're going to find many videos of MRAs sitting around talking about how they could, would, or should seek to regress women back to the kind of status that they enjoy in the Middle East or some other third world countries. It's completely disingenuous to assert something like that, but this is said to a very large round of applause. It may have been, in fact, the largest round of applause I heard in this conference. It was an hour plus. It may have been an hour and a half. I can't remember. But that's a little bit disconcerting. I'm hoping there were some reasonably minded people in there who were just clapping so that they didn't have to feel uncomfortable, because this is some crazy talk. And obviously, I think this is a completely disingenuous way to reframe someone's challenge, criticism, to say that that's their intent. And these are by feminist scholars. These are people who should know better, and I'm pretty sure they do know better. I think this is an intentional attempt to demonize and to off-put any criticism that they might receive. This is a great way to, at the same time as you're dismissing the challenge, demonize the people making the challenge. And I do think that this is a reasonable challenge made by reasonable people to say not only should we be focusing, and of course obviously feminists, if that's their platform, should be focusing on that, but it should also encompass things like not letting our celebrities and our politicians get away with turning a blind eye to the plight of women in other countries like that by heaping a bunch of praise on known misogynists, that this represents a problem. And in fact, I think in some ways it indicates a tacit approval of the behavior if you're not calling it out. And again, I have yet to hear any feminists calling out Barack Obama for heaping such humanitarian-style praise on someone who would be, I think, easily, arguably, a misogynist and is promoting the oppression of women, the ownership of women, etc., etc. In fact, really, it's a clever little bit of sophistry to take this challenge that's made and turn it around and make it seem as though it's a misogynist threat in and of itself. Now, admittedly, it had been a while since I'd watched the video, and I reviewed it again this morning, and I'd forgotten actually how bad some of the rhetoric in that discussion really was. Not only do they attempt to dismiss the challenge in this disingenuous way, but they actually have gone as far as to say that to challenge the oppression and the status of women in the Middle East would be racist. That it would be sort of saying that they don't know any better and that they're ignorant, that this would be an incredibly racist thing to do. And I thought to myself, I don't know how it is that it's racist if you challenge the status quo and the standards in another country, that's racist. But if you do it at home with your own women, who maybe even declare that they're not feminists, that's okay, right? So in the one hand, in the one case, you're just helping to educate your sisters, and in the other case, it would be incredibly racist to try to help women out of some very serious oppression and some very serious assaults and attacks on their liberty. Let's not forget that, of course, when the discussions are had about women in the West who are declaring that they are not feminists, generally speaking, that's sort of the assertions that are made is that they're ignorant of the position. They're ignorant of a lot of these issues, and they need to get an education. So apparently that's not an affront. And also, a lot of these feminists, when they talk about their oppression and their lack of liberation, they talk about system structures, that they became aware of these structures and how these structures pervade their lives. And I can't think of anything more structured than some of the ways that these societies are conducted in some of these countries that are very oppressive to women. Oh, and I might add, not necessarily a walk in the park for men either. But wait, there's more. Yes, it gets worse. Then they go a step further to say that there are fatwas existing in the West, that Western women, feminists in particular, are under constant threat of assault and rape and murder for speaking their minds. And of course, first of all, what they're doing is they're making it seem as though they're sort of trying to cloak this in the idea that threats on the internet or even in conferences are the sole province of feminists, that no one else on the internet receives death threats and that sort of thing. And of course, all you have to do to receive a few death threats on the internet is have a little bit of contentious speech. And I don't even mean contentious against the status quo or contentious against standardized knowledge, but just contentious with anyone, regardless of which one of you holds the rational position. And they're sort of making it seem as though feminists are the only ones who've ever received this. Or far worse, to equate death threats on the internet with women who really are oppressed, women who can be stoned to death and raped for speaking their minds. In fact, women who can be stoned to death for the crime of having been raped. I mean, you want to talk about victim blaming. There's your ultimate form of victim blaming. To stone to death a woman because she had been raped. And I don't hear a lot about that. Apparently, it's racist to talk about that kind of victim blaming. In fact, in another video that I was watching today, there was far too much reverence given to the cultures and the traditions of some of these other countries and how we should tread lightly when we're talking about these things. And I think when it comes to human rights, treading lightly is to ensure victimhood, real victimhood. And I just think it's an insult beyond compare to somehow equate a few death threats on the internet and maybe a bomb threat at a conference with women who can actually be stoned to death for contentious speech, women who can actually be stoned to death for any one of a number of different offenses, including trying to get an education or even having a fucking Facebook page. And while Anita Sarkeesian's apparent claim to fame, at least within this conference, is the fact that she has been harassed and threatened since she started her Kickstarter, to the point where she's actually boastful about it. She makes the claim that it forms the background radiation of her life. I think it's really, really disgusting to try to equate this with some of the things that can happen to women in other parts of the world for merely speaking their mind. And all the while, barely paying lip service to it, if at all, such as in the case, again, with the former Saudi king and his own 2 daughters, who were apparently held under house arrest for speaking out against some of the policies of the government and their own father. Where was the feminist backlash against Barack Obama for heaping all this praise on this former Saudi king? I think what happens is, of course, that reasonable people everywhere, reasonable women, see some of these arguments that are made, see some of the things that are being done in the name of feminism, and they reject it as extremist, as radicalized. And I have to say, I agree with them. I could go on for hours about the depiction of men in these conferences. I've listened to a bunch of them now. You can see them on the internet if you like. I'll link the one below that I'm referring to specifically, and I'm going to play a clip following my speech here. And they were ideas at the house, I think. It was at the Sydney Opera House, this particular group of talks. And the disparaging comments and remarks about men, and they're really discriminatory and prejudicial. These are sort of all-encompassing statements about how men are certain ways, and you know, men are violent, and men, you know, it goes on. And I think reasonable women recognize the men within their own lives, the men and boys within their own lives, and the love that they have for them and the love that they share in reciprocation. And they just reject these radical and extremist notions. And I think that's why the majority of women, despite the pronouncements of feminists, do not identify themselves as feminist. And they reject a lot of the tenets of modern day feminism. And that does not mean, of course, that they should reject and send back all of the gains that were made by the first waves of feminism. These were very important movements, and I think equality and meritocracy are the ways out of a lot of the messes that we've gotten ourselves into as a species. But I don't feel that modern day third wave feminism is getting us there. I think it's actually driving a further wedge between the sexes. That's never a good thing. I don't like a wedge between me and my female loved ones. Thanks very much for watching. Stay tuned for a little clip.
So one of the things that I'm sure every one of us has had said to us at some point is women in the West have it really good, and if you want to know who's really suffering, go to the Middle East. So not only is that underpinned by incredible racism, underpinned by this idea that somehow Middle Eastern Arab women, particularly Muslim women, don't know what it is that they're doing and they're just constantly living in this state of oppression. But also, fundamentally what's being said there is, we could treat you like that. We choose not to, but just understand that we could do that to you. That is the threat that is being said. And actually, and when I hear that and it's balanced then with this outrage that I get from men that, they just pick this statistic out, 99% of men are good, decent men and they'd never harm women. You're like, well, you might not be taking an axe round to their house. But what you're doing is it's this pervasive kind of threat that ripples across everything, that this is what we could do to you. This is the threat that you have to live with. And interestingly, like tying it back then to this racist kind of idea of the Arab world, that never let it be said that in the West we don't have our own fatwas. You know, that we don't have this constant threat of murdering and killing and harming women who are essentially just standing up and speaking the truth about their own lives. Yes, Liz.
Sorry, yeah, I was talking about that only the other day because, you know, there is that constant MRA sort of threat about we could treat you as bad as what these women here are treated.